what I'm interested in talking about the new tabloid racialism is what many people have noticed, I think, in recent controversies surrounding Aboriginal futures, the nature of radical Islam, immigrants in Australian society from Africa and other places, the rise of gangs in cities, and more recent and specific controversies such as that surrounding the Aboriginal academic and activist Larissa Behrendt, her views on Aboriginal futures and her tweeting about TV shows. And above all, what's been one of the biggest controversies of recent times is the writing by the Herald Sun columnist Andrew Bolt on Aboriginality and whether Aboriginality can be assessed by skin tone, which is currently obviously the subject of some legal manoeuvres by a number of people, including Behrendt, who he's targeted. There's been many analyses of these sort of controversies, which I think many people find bewildering, confusing, alarming, interesting in equal measure. In terms of Aboriginal debate, relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. But what I want to do is go back a bit and look at some of the roots of the ways in which we think about race, the changing ways we think about race and culture over the last century, half century and more recently, and to show, I hope, that this is really not so much about Indigenous politics as it is about a larger politics of the West and the need that some people have to define an enemy of the West, an other to the West, in order to define the West itself and the way in which that's come under increasing pressure. Some years ago, some enterprising or desperate publisher reprinted the entire series of Victorian school readers, the compendiums of poetry, prose and drama that generations of children in this state were raised on. The readers were of their time, but anyone who expected a thundering Kiplingist defence of empire was to be disappointed in reading them. The foreword of the editions published before the First World War and then between the wars noted that the world wanted peace, and that we were all devoted to this and to living in harmony, and that each race had its contribution to make to the world. Well, until that point, the reader of the modern reader might have thought they were on the same page as that author. But at the sudden mention of the R word, the reader and the reader immediately part company. For just about any expression of collectivity these days, culture, nation, identity, gender, would be acceptable. But race is the one word that has fallen out of the equation if it's talked of in terms of a dominant race or a white race, or race is simply a category to which we have solidarity and adherence. While race can be used for oppressed cultures, for insurgent movements, there's no real way in our era to claim solidarity with the idea of a dominant race or a white race or a major race as a way in which we enter the world. Yet paradoxically, in that earlier era, no category was more unquestioned. No way of entering the world was more dominant. One was simply a member of a race, and that gave a large amount of meaning to life. What made that conception of race so radically unacceptable? I think the answer's obvious. Whatever relatively neutral conception of race had applied even between the world wars, it was swept away by the Second World War and the revelations of the Holocaust. In the wake of those events and the realisation of what a doctrine of racial purity, racial identity could actually lead to, a different conception of humanity became official, from the creation of the UN to the 1948 Convention on Human Rights. The post-war period ushered in an era of liberalism in which the notion of a common humanity was implanted in the educational system and further extended by mass post-war immigration and the rise of a universalised youth market in music and style. The notion of race as a biologically grounded category was replaced with the notion of culture, which essentially foregrounded the idea that communities could be made and remade, and which was a step on the way to the idea of a multicultural society. The bold attempts to create a post-war sense of the family of man could hardly be called a total success. Post-war mass migration was met with relative generosity in Australia, yet both arrivals and natives never found themselves short of a way of categorising the other, with the favour quickly returned from wog to skip and back again. No matter how vicious or violent this could get at times, no matter how much loose residual ideas of racial difference survived, the idea that Mediterraneans were inherently excitable or Anglo-Saxons inherently repressed and so on, the essential idea of racial destiny and racial purity had, it seems, been permanently excluded from the realm of the political. So if there was still a great deal of racism about, both politically and informally, there was very little racialism, the deeper doctrine of racial particularity and racial superiority. Indeed, the whole notion of a distinct idea of racialism was to a great degree lost from view. Racism itself became a more complex process since it could float across different boundaries, fuse and combine in different ways. Old pre-war notions of a hierarchy of races became confused as American black culture became identified as the dominant mode of youth culture, the one to aspire to. Fluid and multicultural world that we came to live in varied not merely in terms of character, but in terms of social class. Mass immigration and multiculturalism and the notion of a universal humanity increasingly became the preserve of a new generation and a new social class that was in self universalised. The class that's often, known as the new class, for want of a better term. People working in policy, academia, culture, knowledge production, those sorts of worlds. By the very nature of this new class, given enormous power to reshape the everyday lives of the population at large, universal humanity was a given. Globally interconnected, continually in search of the new and avant-garde, the values of that class meant that the cultural life of other classes came to be to a degree an eclipse. The more bounded lives, more parochial lives of rural society or the industrial working class and the traditional bourgeoisie. Because these social classes remained in some sort of equal power through the 70s and 80s, things were sort of kept in a type of alignment, if you like. But by the 1990s, these new class divisions had become fundamental. In the West, the only social class that was winning was the so-called new class, while other classes were slipping backwards, losing their power and centrality. At that point, the aspiration towards a cosmopolitan world ceased to be a general cultural movement and became the mark of a specific class. It became an assertion of class power rather than a consensus idea of the way society should move. This disjuncture was marked by various moments, especially around about the early 1990s. The ubiquity of the notion of political correctness dates from this time. The idea that one class was imposing a whole set of ways of living which other classes didn't necessarily agree with. The rise of the idea of the elites, which was not the old idea of the elites who were people who were actually rich and powerful and owned stuff, but elites who could control ways of speaking, cultural ways of being. And of course, the main political event, if you like, that this led to in Australia was the rise of the Howard government and a substantial shift in the way we started to think about Australian life. As it turned out, however, much of this would be a prelude to a much greater division which was created by the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. At this cataclysmic point, the entire post-war ideology of humanism, of universalism, was instantly and massively repudiated. 9/11 became a focused, recovered return of an older idea, the clash of civilizations, the idea of the ways of life were incommensurable and could not be reconciled in some sort of universal humanism. And, of course, the group that this became focused on was, in successive variations, first the relatively tiny group of Al-Qaeda, of a violent fundamentalist Islamism, and then of the wider movement of Islamist groups in the Middle East, and eventually on Islam itself. But it wasn't all of Islam, which stretched obviously, across the world from Africa right through to Indonesia. A particular form of Islam came to be targeted, and that was obviously Arab Islam. And so the idea came to be that 9/11 was not merely the expression of a radical terrorist group, but was the expression of a particular religious sensibility and of the failure of a particular religious sensibility. So Islam became not merely one, Arab Islam became not merely one civilization and culture among others, but in fact was treated as essentially a subnormal, a criminal type of culture and civilization. Something, the argument was, had gone wrong with Islam, and perhaps something was always fundamentally wrong with Islam. Now, of course, Islam is a religion, and Arab civilization is a collectivity of different peoples. But what was interesting in this process was the way in which, even though it was being attached to religious and cultural categories, a new form of the old racialism was being smuggled in. The new idea that not merely could a whole culture be blamed for a specific event by a smaller group of people, but that something deep and originary within that culture and within that people was wrong, that it was wrong at the root, radically wrong. Radically other. And this, of course, provided the sense of an enemy, the sense of an other that could define the West in the wake of the 9/11 era. This was something that arose not merely in response to the 9/11 era, but was also a response to the collapse of the old enemy of the West, which was communism. So you'd had a decade of relatively sort of postmodern, if you like, drift in which the West was finding it difficult to define itself. Cultures like China were rising, increasing competition in terms of moving forward into the future and ways of life. Then you have this extraordinary event, 9/11, and from that event is created the whole notion of an irretrievable clash of civilizations, and that then propels you on not merely to dealing with the 9/11 and the specific causes, but into the whole chaotic adventure in Iraq and Afghanistan, which stretched on through much of the decade. And that then became a symbiotic relationship between that adventure, that projection of power by the West, and the need to define that enemy in increasingly racialist and essential sort of terms. So then we had the rise of people starting to talk, as they had once talked, of other alien peoples, especially the Jews, as some sort of enemy within. The Arab Muslim immigrants to Europe became not merely a group of people who may or may not be assimilating, may or may not be integrating, but some sort of fifth column, some sort of dagger pointed at the heart of European civilization in the writings of people like Mark Stein and Andrew Caldwell. In Australia, what we got with the rise of the expanded world of news media online, with the rise of blogging by columnists and opinion writers, was a veritable industry of that form of hatred and the necessary creation, the relentless creation of an enemy to be attached to whatever social phenomenon came along. So whether it was the complex issue of gang crime in an area like outer Sydney, whether it was crime associated with African immigrants in Melbourne, any individual crime by people who happened to be Muslim came to be seen as an expression not of social causes, cultural causes, individual evil or individual wrong, but of a notion, of a racialist notion, that this was an expression of an essential wrongness. The trouble is for this sort of formation, for this sort of process, was that as this was happening, the West's main projection of power, of purpose, of the idea of an innately superior West was falling apart in Afghanistan, falling apart in Iraq, falling apart with an event like Hurricane Katrina, which showed the leader of the West, the United States, to be relatively incompetent and indecisive, and ultimately and finally with the 2008 financial collapse, which showed that the whole system which underpinned the West was fragile, jerry-built, and the reverse of triumphant. Now, in many circumstances, that might have provoked a rethink among some people. In this case, it hasn't. What it has created, with the racialist genie out of the bottle, the racialist way of thinking about enemies, about others that cannot be assimilated, cannot be dealt with, cannot be in dialogue with, has been a search for new enemies, for new others. And it seems to me that it's in that respect that the political right have returned to Indigenous people and Aboriginal people and to new ways of talking about Indigenous people. Comes the hour, comes as and the person who can talk in the most racialist way to date has been, of course, Andrew Bolt, who has gone where nobody else was really willing to go, into the very old, the very archaic notions of biological race, of measuring the colour of one's skin to see if they are in fact a member of that race, ahead perhaps of measuring their skull or counting their teeth. And it's interesting, it's very interesting that that Andrew Bolt comes from a tradition that makes it easier for him to go into a point where many right-wing people even would fear to tread. Because Bolt is a neo-Calvinist. Bolt is from a Dutch family. His father was an itinerant preacher in the outback. And one of the interesting things about the neo-Calvinist church, which rose up in the Netherlands in the 19th century, is that above all it is concerned with the notion of purity. Originally of religious purity and separating itself from the Catholic Church in the Netherlands, but eventually that was rolled over into a notion of racial purity. And that, of course, in Dutch South Africa became the cultural roots from which apartheid sprang. And over in Australia, where no one else would really think to go, for someone like Andrew Bolt, it's an idea that can inform the notion that, of course, one should look at the purity of who is speaking as an Aboriginal and whether they're allowed to speak in that way. That would seem to me, that and the fact that that has not met more concerted condemnation from what you might call the sensible right, would seem to me to suggest that these processes, the process of looking for an enemy, of looking for another, of looking for a way to define the West, have got a ways to go yet. That this is a new process as the West becomes less certain of itself, as it loses its capacity to define itself through adventures like Iraq and Afghanistan. What becomes the dominant force is the search for new enemies. And that then becomes Muslims, it becomes African immigrants, becomes Aboriginal people who dare to be from two worlds rather than a sort of notion of a noble savage Aboriginal. And in that respect, one would have to wonder where such a process would end and how far we can go back to the older ideas of incommensurable civilizations, enemies we can't have dialogue with, and where this will take us. And it's worth thinking about the process by which we got to this point, and the sort of the final act of racialism, the dual final act of racialism in the prelude to this period. Now, one, of course, I've mentioned was the Holocaust, but the other was in the other theatre of war, was in the war, in the Pacific War, where in order to properly run the war, it became necessary to mount a furious propaganda campaign to present the Japanese as subhuman, a process which then had to be sort of undone as the Japanese then became our trading partners in the post-war era. But the point that led to really was that it was possible to use the atom bomb on the Japanese in a way that was not contemplated so wantonly in terms of the European theatre of war. So what we ended up with, if you like, was a double catastrophe, a double genocide. And I'd suggest that the wanton encouragement of these sorts of ways of thinking is perhaps an instalment on the way to something like that, with new enemies and in new theatres of war. Thanks very much.